Good morning, everyone. My name is John Barano. I'm a partner here at Covington and Burling. On behalf of my colleagues, welcome to Covington. We are here. Initially, I thought this was an intervention with Philip, but it turns out he had a whole program planned for you today, which looks terrific. The Covington is, we occupied this space about 2 years ago, and we're quite proud of it, so we're happy to have opportunities to host events for you. It's a great attendance list, and we appreciate clients and aspiring clients to be here today. We're at a very interesting inflection point, obviously, on many fronts with the new incoming administration. And as Howard pointed out, as Philip pointed out in his op-ed this morning in the Washington Post that I hope you had a chance to read, it's an important time for the Trump administration to consider an opportunity to be transformational with regard to regulatory reform. So we have a great program today, and with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Diana and the first panel. And the panelists will each speak for about 5 minutes from the podium, make their proposals, and then there'll be time for Q&A at the end of each panel. But welcome. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Oh, come on. Where you have to be high energy. We're here for reform. Good morning. That's better. I'm delighted to be here today to address one of the most important issues for the success of our communities and our country, and that is getting moving on infrastructure. There are many challenges before us, but few are more pressing than how we can more effectively and efficiently deliver critical infrastructure to maintain economic competitiveness and to enhance quality of life for all Americans. And it's time to reform how we approach environmental review and permitting of infrastructure projects. We need simply to change the rules. The current framework doesn't really work for anyone, and it's not working as it was intended to work. In the interest of full disclosure, I am a self-confessed NEPA nerd. I am a true believer in the National Environmental Policy Act. So imagine my surprise when I had the opportunity to meet with Lyndon Caldwell, one of the primary authors of the National Environmental Policy Act. And he shared with me that he felt his life's work had been a failure, that the implementation was not at all what was envisioned, and that it was time to retire NEPA. This was quite shocking for somebody who had spent decades practicing as a NEPA practitioner. But I came to appreciate his perspective in that we can do better and we can work within some of the existing regulations to make a more successful process for delivery of infrastructure. We can all agree that our current approach is frustrating and takes too long and costs too much, and as a result, we forego many opportunities for success. Previous efforts have nibbled around the edges of our existing system, and the time is now because we can and we must do better. We've learned a lot from the environmental review process under NEPA and our current regulatory and permitting system. And it's time to put that knowledge to good use to get improved outcomes. Imagine a different approach, one with clearer lines of authority and accountability, one that prioritizes and fast-tracks essential projects. How about incentivizing and rewarding good planning, past performance, and environmental stewardship instead of the current one-size-fits-all approach? Can we make better use of technology to make our process more efficient and effective? And most importantly, how can we allocate and channel resources to focus on real issues instead of process for process's sake or trying to avoid the threat of litigation? So what can we do differently? And how can we evolve and reform our current system? We have a panel of accomplished experts here today who will share their views on the issues and what we need to get done to get moving on infrastructure. After introductions, we'll hear remarks from all of our panelists, and then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. So let me introduce our panel. First, we have Richard Kidd, who is on the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, and he's going to talk a bit about the work of that agency and some of the improvements that have been made. We'll then hear from Philip Howard, Chair of Common Good, and he's got a couple of very interesting proposals that address some of the red tape and bureaucracy that we currently experience. Michael Schmidt is a former economic policy advisor to Hillary Clinton, and he's going to make some remarks around funding. And then finally, Donald Elliott, who is the co-chair of Covington's environmental practice, will share some observations pulling it all together. So with that, please join me in welcoming Richard Kidd.
Thank you, Diana. I appreciate that. Thanks for our organizers for this great space and for this venue to talk about this important issue. When FAST 41 Act was passed, there was some commentary written. I think the authors are in the room, and they rhetorically asked, who would take the job as executive director of FIPSI at this stage in the administration? Sort of with a parenthetical of who would be dumb enough to take. Anyway, that's me. I'm that guy. And just a little bit of introduction. So I'm a career senior executive, and I've worked alongside political appointees from both parties. I get excited about improving the delivery of public goods and services, and there's certainly lots of opportunities to improve the delivery of federal permitting when it comes to major infrastructure. So I'm thankful for the White House and others on the team to have given me this opportunity. As we engage in this discussion today, we sort of have two broad policy options ahead of us, in my view, and the good news is they are not necessarily in conflict. One option is wholesale regulatory reform, and I think you're going to hear that option explained in greater detail from the other panelists. I'm going to stay silent on sort of that issue. But the other option is to take advantage of the lessons that have been learned and the bipartisan, the opportunities created in the FAST Act, FAST 41, and the bipartisan consensus around the improvements that could be made within the existing framework. And the good news is, as I said, is these are not mutually exclusive. In fact, wisdom and prudence would suggest that you do all that you can to improve the current system while perhaps working at the same time to implement reforms. So I just want to give you a quick update as to what the opportunities are for the Trump administration as it comes into office. So FAST 41, Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, Section 41, created the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, all right? That council started to take shape in August, and now essentially 6 months later, there's a substantial platform and a coherence of structure and ideas that the new administration can use. So let me just explain some of those, what they are. First of all, there's my position. You have an executive director position in the White House that reports to the president on infrastructure. Didn't have that before. You have infrastructure permitting reform in the job description of deputy secretaries, 13 of them who make up the council. All right. You actually have the council itself, which has met and is starting to exercise and develop the muscles of government, which didn't exist a few months ago. You have an unprecedented degree of public transparency and accountability. That technology tools that Diana talked about, there's the permitting dashboard. I would encourage you to take a look at that. And on that dashboard, you're going to see the results of, for the first time ever, coordinated project plans where a lead federal agency has written a plan and put forth a timeline for how they are going to permit and coordinate the permitting on projects. What's interesting is what you won't see is the back end of that dashboard where we are collecting performance data on how the government agencies are actually doing in regards to their plan. Now, there's not much now, but over time, this management data will be invaluable to improving the process, all right? It will tell us what agencies are or are not meeting their timelines, why they are not meeting their timelines, and what sort of external factors may impact the permitting process. We are going to keep track of those external factors, state, local, financial, or otherwise, that puts the federal action on hold. And that will also be part of the record and the accountability so that all of us can work together for improvement. So also, in the statute, and a lot of the commentary has missed this, there's a very key attribute called the Environmental Review Improvement Fund. Seldom has Congress given such financial flexibility and authorities to an entity or an individual. So the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council has access to this fund that they can use to accelerate permitting improvement reforms, all right? Right now there's no money in that fund, but this is a great opportunity going forward. So speaking of going forward, with all humbleness that I've only been on the job for 6 months, I've got a couple of areas of advice. First of all, the new administration should support the position of the executive director. My replacement needs to have, as we call it in this town, political juice, all right? They need to be connected. They need to have walk-in privileges to the chief of staff and the director of OMB, and they need to speak with a position of authority from the White House. Additionally, that fund needs to be capitalized. If we're going to do any sort of deficit financing for infrastructure reform, perhaps the best $30 million that could be spent would be to put $30 million into that fund so the executive director has both influence and resources. And those are the two things you need to get things done in this town, all right? Second is I would hold the deputy secretaries accountable, all right? So this administration and the transition papers to the incoming administration has says make permitting reform a priority for the deputy secretaries. So the new administration needs to do that. It needs to hold them accountable, and they need to get that on their top 5 or 6 items on their to-do list. Finally, we should recognize that permitting is actually done by people. These are processes done by people, not machines, all right? And that often at the regional, state, and local levels, improvements need to be made through investments in human capital, all right? Reducing the workload through process improvements is important, but an arbitrary timeline without a corresponding increase in efficiency or resources could just be a rush to no, all right? No one wants a 2-year time limit that ends in no, all right? So when you talk about these things, tone matters. The people are out there who are doing good, hard work, and tone can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If permitting reform advocates claim that the federal employees are the problem, that is likely to be true. If, on the other hand, permitting reform activities also include provisions for investing in our workforce, training, professionalization, expansion, then I think that the permitting reform advocates will be well received and welcomed by the federal employees. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm Philip Howard. It's wonderful to, nice you all to come. We have a wonderful group of panelists. I thank them all for coming. It's great to be associated with a law firm like Covington because there are a lot of people smarter than I am in the firm. And the infrastructure project we've been working on for the last year and a half has been done with the substantial help of 3 Covington colleagues, 2 former general counsels of EPA, Don Elliott and Gary Guzzi, and also Richard Burling, who was a longtime Hill staffer. So without their help, we couldn't have done this. Last year, we created, we published a white paper called 2 Years, Not 10 Years. It's out there. And what we found is that a 6-year delay in permitting more than doubles the effective cost of infrastructure. That's a huge number. We could build twice as much infrastructure if we had a permitting regime similar to that of greener countries like Germany, for example. We also found that lengthy environmental review typically is dramatically harmful to the environment. And the reason is because it prolongs the bottlenecks. If it were a terrible project that were controversial, it might not be bad for the environment, but if you're trying to upgrade the grid, the electric grid, or you're trying to eliminate traffic bottlenecks or rail bottlenecks, it's vital that those decisions get made promptly to prevent ongoing unnecessary pollution. Now, as Diana mentioned, no one actually designed the system to work this way. The CEQ regs themselves say that environmental reviews should be 150 pages and 300 pages at the most in a complex project. It's just sort of evolved in this way because no one was making the decisions of where to draw the line and what was needed. And the harm here is not just the 2 harms I mentioned. Probably the biggest harm, people in the business tell me, is that good projects never get off the drawing board because uncertainty kills financing. It kills the project. People don't know how long it's going to take. So it's incredibly important to come up with a process that, that the people making the investment can rely upon. What's missing, we think, is actually quite straightforward, and Richard and Diana referred to it, is we need to layer on top of all the improvements like the dashboard and other things, which are quite useful as a platform, we need to layer clear lines of authority. We've proposed, and we have out on the table, a three pages of legislative amendments. It's in this piece of paper, 3 pages of legislative amendments to the FAST Act that would give the chairman of the Council of Environmental Quality the authority to resolve all issues regarding the scope and inadequacy of environmental review. In a project like the Bayonne Bridge, which was just raising the roadway using existing foundations to permit a new generation of ships to go into Newark Harbor, one can imagine the chairman of CEQ saying, oh, you're using the same foundations, you're just raising the bridge, just give me 50 or 100 pages on the construction impacts of that. Instead, we had 20,000 pages of environmental review and exhibits over 5 years for that project, which had, most people believe, only marginal, if any, environmental impact. The second change is that we would give the head of OMB the authority to resolve disputes among competing agencies or disputing agencies. One of the problems with modern government, and this is somewhat unavoidable, is you don't get a permit from the government, you get a permit from 24 governments. The Corps of Engineers doesn't agree with the Department of Transportation, which doesn't agree with the Environmental Protection Agency, which doesn't agree with the next agency, Fish and Wildlife Commission, et cetera. So the disputes that inevitably arise there, often for valid reasons, need to get resolved. There need to be balancing choices. Someone needs to have the authority to resolve those disputes, and the people who resolve those decisions need to be themselves accountable to someone who's politically accountable. The chair of CEQ and the head of OMB both report to the president, who are elected by the citizens to make executive decisions, and so our proposed statute does that. It makes a couple of other changes, clarifying standards of judicial review and stuff, but the important point is we're not changing substantive law. NEPA is still there. You still have to have a good faith environmental review. Really important to do that. It's very important to comply with a variety of important laws that impact environmental and other laws over the years, but there needs to be a mechanism to make decisions and move forward. This 3-page statute would do that. And I'll leave by saying President Obama in 2009 had over $800 billion to spend on a variety of stimulus projects. About a third of it was supposed to go to infrastructure. Only a tiny fraction of it went to infrastructure. That's because there was, quote, no such thing as a shovel-ready project. That's a problem of red tape. It's not a problem of money. It's a problem of the loss of authority mechanisms, clear lines of authority and accountability in the current structure of government. It's easy to fix it. We just need the will to do it. Thank you.
Is this on, or am I using the? Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Schmidt. I was an economic policy advisor on Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Philip, thank you for putting this together. It's great for me to have a reason to get out of bed in the morning these days, and so. I'm going to talk about infrastructure funding and financing, so a bit of a different track than the question of permitting. I think often when we talk about how we're going to get our money to invest in infrastructure, there's a lack of analytical clarity around the alphabet soup of programs and infrastructure banks and trust funds and this and that. And having a framework through which to understand the options, I think, can be helpful. And for me, the most helpful distinction to be drawn is between funding infrastructure and what might be called financing infrastructure. When you fund infrastructure, you take public resources, you invest it in an infrastructure project, and the government doesn't expect anything in return. It's investment in a public good. It generates economic benefits, increased tax revenues. When you finance infrastructure, you're investing in a specific project, and the revenue from that project, usually through tolls or some other type of user fees, supports the investment in the project, usually investment in the project's debt or its equity. And the good thing about financing infrastructure projects is that you can get private capital to do it, either instead of or alongside the public investment in infrastructure, and that's the magic of so-called public-private partnerships. Historically, the federal government has overwhelmingly been in the business of funding infrastructure investment. So we collected the gas tax, we funded the Highway Trust Fund, we distribute to the states, they build a highway system, they maintain the highway system, they do capital projects. In recent decades, the politics of funding infrastructure in our country have become strained or severely strained. So we haven't increased the gas tax since 1993. We have a patchwork of efforts kind of year to year, or recently we had a longer term extension, but it's not kind of promising over the long term. There are other solutions out there. The Obama administration proposed a fee on oil production. Needless to say, that didn't have a lot of legs in Congress. The Obama administration has also proposed a one-time tax on unrepatriated corporate profits, a little more promising politically, but still hasn't gone anywhere. There has been discussion, mostly on the kind of center and center left. I think Larry Summers has been a major proponent of major deficit-funded infrastructure investment, and I think there is a very good substantive case to be made for that, given the current interest rate environment. But again, what is the appetite on Capitol Hill, and in the context of tax plans that are likely to put a strain on the federal budget, how does the substantive picture look in the new government? So the natural thing then is to look at private financing of infrastructure, and it's a really important public policy priority. It's one that on the Clinton campaign we embraced full-throatedly through our proposal for an infrastructure bank. It was something she personally felt strongly about. The Trump campaign also talked about private financing of infrastructure. They put forward a proposal to provide tax credits to the equity tranche of public-private partnerships. But I guess if I could leave you with a thought, it's that the private financing of infrastructure, while important to encourage, can't be seen as the panacea. And that's because of the distinction I drew at the very beginning, which is that the project needs to be able to produce revenues that can sustain private investment. And a lot of the really important infrastructure investments in our country, repairing a stretch of highway that's littered with potholes, for example, repairing a bridge that doesn't have a toll, a lot of the most critical investments aren't going to be able to support private financing. So in that landscape, it is the kind of key question is whether the new government is able to find political space to meaningfully increase infrastructure funding. And then the secondary question is what design choices are they going to be making in terms of how they encourage private investment in infrastructure?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to thank particularly Philip Howard and Common Good for all the good work they've done on this project. And I would really recommend that everybody pick up and take a look at the report, 2 years, not 10 years, that's outside. It makes really two main points, and I just want to leave you with two basic ideas The key elements to speeding up infrastructure permitting are, number one, setting deadlines, and number two, having a clear decider. And one of the things that the review of infrastructure permitting worldwide shows is that many countries, which are even more environmentally conscious than we are, manage to permit major projects in under 2 years. So I really disagree with my friend Mr. Kidd that arbitrary deadlines without more resources is a problem. That's usually the government refrain in my experience, increase the resources. And I just disagree with that. The purpose of deadlines is to require people to set priorities. And one of the problems with the NEPA process is that the incentives are, as Philip Howard has said with his much more colorful style than mine, to leave no pebble unturned. The incentive structure is not to focus on the big issues. It's for the opponents of a project to find some little issue that hasn't been adequately discussed so that they can stop the project. This is not a program, unfortunately, it's been hijacked. It's not really a program to do environmental reviews, unfortunately. And therefore, as a result, when Congress wants something to be done, they typically exempt it from the NEPA process. There are over 32 statutory exemptions where there's no environmental review. And that's why there's a real opportunity for bipartisan reform here, because I think environmentalists like Linton Caldwell increasingly recognize that too much, too long, too delayed a process that doubles the costs of infrastructure reform is really the enemy. It's not achieving the goals that it was originally intended to achieve. I'm a longtime supporter of NEPA. There are many, many government programs that incorporate these principles of a deadline and a decider. Under the Toxic Substance Control Act, EPA has to decide on 20 new chemicals a day as to whether or not they should go on the market. They have 90 days to do that. That can be extended once for 180 days. They make decisions within a week on 90% of the chemicals. Same thing in litigation. Judges found that discovery went on forever until they set deadlines. What do deadlines do? They require people to set priorities to focus on the big and important issues, not leave no pebble unturned, or essentially defensive medicine that feeds back into the process so that agencies are looking at smaller and smaller issues. Similarly, Paul Noe is here, former deputy at OIRA. When you have a major rule, it's going to cost the economy $100 million. OIRA gets 90 days to look at it. What does that do? That creates an incentive to focus on the big issues, the important issues, and that's what other countries do and what we don't do. I'm glad to report that I know that the Trump administration is looking at some executive orders, and Daniel Flores from the House will be here. He maybe will talk about some legislation that he's been working on and that we've been helping him with. And both of these initiatives incorporate those basic principles of deadlines and a clear decider. There's also one more thing which is low-hanging fruit, and that is at one of our previous fora, somebody stood up from the National Gas Association and said, we don't really have these problems at the state level. We have these problems at the federal level. And the reason is, typically at the state level, you have somebody like a governor who can really push a project. The federal officials are very, very independent of any political oversight or review, as Susan Dudley and Paul Noe and a lot of us know who've worked in government. Typically, the federal agencies will not start looking at permits until the state permitting process is finished. That's a policy at FERC, that's a policy at the Army Corps of Engineers, and it saves the government a little time, but it greatly increases the costs and the delays. Well, I'm hopeful that we actually will be able to get this going, and I take my hat off to Mr. Kidd. Philip and I tried to persuade the White House not to try to speed up the process by creating another interagency committee. But if it actually works to speed up the process, I'll be the first one to take my hat off to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our panelists for some very thought-provoking remarks and some common themes regarding the need for certainty, for clear accountability, for clear lines of authority. I'd like to ask our audience if anybody has any questions they'd like to lead off the discussion with. Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is Fred Wagner with Beveridge and Diamond, former General Counsel of the Federal Highway Administration, US DOT, under President Obama. And I'd like to reiterate an important point, is let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Under MAP 21, under the FAST Act, the U.S. Department of Transportation was a leader in creating many of the same reforms that many of you have already talked about. And in implementing those reforms, we were able to, for example, finish the Tappan Zee environmental impact statement in 1 year. And that project is underway. It's being built, a $4 billion project that's contributing to the economy. There are so many instances where the decision-making authority already exists, where reforms and law already exist, and in fact, the Federal Highway Administration's Everyday Counts initiative was so successful, it's been codified into the FAST Act. So what I would urge people to do is to think about the things that have already been done, and let's build on those successes. I was come see, come saw on the new agency for the reasons that you identified, sir, at the end. Do we need another separate entity to do this? And it has potential, I think, Mr. Kidd, in a lot of ways. But the administration had informal rapid response teams in transportation, energy, and transmission, which was very successful in breaking free many, many stuck projects and got institutional reform by actually talking to each other, by creating situations where the bureaucrats actually talk to each other. So it's a comment more than a question that regulatory reform has its downfalls, but look at what's already been built already and don't necessarily rebuild it.
Can we comment on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I think there are a number of very good principles in the FAST Act, and my skepticism about adding another layer of interagency committee should not be taken as condemning a number of the other good things. I do think it's limited, as you know, to the transportation area.
That's not true.
No?
No, it's not true. It applies to many, many different types of infrastructure projects. There's a monetary cutoff, however. It's mostly designed to get at big stuff, impactful type projects. So it's not just...
My understanding is it doesn't apply to like pipelines and the electric grid. And
read the act. It's applied more broadly. There are certain things that were exempted, I think, in the energy sector, but it applies to a broader cross-section of projects.
Well, in any event, I do think that the idea of setting deadlines and having a clear decider, I think it incorporates many of the principles that Philip and I have favored, and I would agree with you. Rather than sweep it aside, we ought to build on it and expand it. So I don't really disagree with the main point of your comments.
You know, if you find any project that works, you'll find purposeful leaders, as in the case of the Tappan Zee Bridge, who actually drive it forward. They say, we're going to take responsibility, we're going to drive this forward, we're going to do the review, the review has been going on for about 15 years, I think, but we're going to finish the review in 1 year and make decisions. The problem is that's not the default way decisions are made in the infrastructure permitting process. It's more often made with people, it seems to me, trying to avoid responsibility, even when you have, in the case of the Bayonne Bridge, which I studied extensively, one purposeful agent, trying to drive it forward, constantly punching a pillow with one of the in that case, 24 different permits in the agency they need to deal with. So, so just to reiterate, and again, supporting what you said, but if you put on top of that a clearer line of authority, it's very hard for people to avoid responsibility for making decisions. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're trying to create clarity on the top so that people realize they can't just kick the can down the road.
And just to add one thing, if our colleague Gary Guzzi, who also served in the Obama administration, were here, he would point out there were a lot of other reforms that CEQ did during the Obama administration. and that 90% of environmental reviews work rather quickly, and I think the system works well. The place that it doesn't work is on about 10% of the projects where you have determined opponents that are using the process not to try to improve the environmental impacts, but to stop the project. And I think the first step is to understand what the nature of the problem is in order to deal with it. And that is not a problem that is easily solved by more interagency collaboration or discussion. And that's why I think ultimately we need a decider. Somebody has got to say, okay, you know, when I was at EPA as general counsel, my administrator, we'd all argue, my colleague and friend Jim Strzok is here, we'd all argue, and at a certain point, the administrator would put up his hand and say, okay, I've heard enough, I'm ready to decide. That's what we don't have in this process, and that, in my opinion, is what we need.
Well, one of the things we're talking around is really cultural change. And if we step back and look at the time when our environmental framework was enacted, we needed a cultural change to increase awareness of the importance of environmental issues. So we've done that. We're now in a new era with different priorities. And so we need to think about what kinds of cultural changes and how we administer our environmental framework are necessary. And Richard, you started touching on it when you talked about workforce development. All of the speakers talked about accountability and certainty. What do you see as the essential ingredients to advancing that cultural change? So we're not reinventing the wheel, but at the same time, we're improving the processes that are in place.
So, am I working? Didn't you hear me yet? All right. Let me turn this on. Thanks, that's a very good question.
You're forever in my debt.
On more than one front. Thank you very much for letting me lead off today. No, so I think the issue is we need to, so as Phil said, you know, he used the term 24 permitting agencies.
Right.
We were only able to count 18, but the point is, we don't have, across those 18 agencies, you don't have a shared sense of purpose or obligation for the project in its totality. Each agency knows very well its level of its particular expertise and its defined statutory requirements. All right?
And we are what we measure, right?
We are what we measure. I think the issue is that there have been many examples across the federal government where you have you start to develop a professional ethos across an activity that may be common to various agencies, such as contracting reform, all right, which is ongoing and had some success. So when I said invest in resources, it may mean more permitting officers, but it may mean the same permitting officers that are well educated and informed about all of the various permitting activities. So if you're permitting a pipeline, have you had instruction on sort of cultural preservation or other aspects of this? So the idea would be to create sort of a professional ethos and also to rotate a lot of the permitting officers. They go into a state or a region and they spend their entire career there, where they may become captive to local or state interests as opposed to the broader interests of a major, permitting of national importance. So it may mean more permitting officers. Look, we found a permitting officer that had 80 environmental assessments, biological assessments that she had to review. That's physically and mentally impossible, all right? So it may need more, but it might just be an investment in the profession of permitting.
Can I comment on that? I think an alternative to more resources is to make the process more efficient.
Yeah.
So there are two different ways to get there. And one of the things I think has happened in recent years that's very encouraging is the notion of preferential corridors. So in other words, rather than reviewing projects one by one, to try to engage in a planning process to identify where a good place for pipelines would be, where a good place for highways would be, where a good place for wind farms would be. And the idea is that will reduce the controversy and try to speed things up. That was part of the 2005 energy bill, and I think it's worked relatively well. That's an example, I think, of how you can make the process more efficient. This is not really a managed process, and there are limits to what CEQ can do by guidance to speed up the process. So I think it really needs to be reworked and rethought. I'm not in favor of getting rid of environmental reviews. I am in favor of making them more efficient and more meaningful. And one example of that is it's almost impossible for a human being to read an environmental impact statement. The original philosophy is...
You should try writing one.
Well, you should try reading one. There's a great line by Dean Wigmore that law review articles are written to be written, not written to be read. And that's true with regard to environmental impact statements. The original theory was that they would inform the decider about environmental issues, and they become a process in and of themselves that has lost touch with what the ultimate goal is.
Yeah, so many different, one of the points, we've been sort of in a cutback mode here, but one of our proposals in our 3-page statute is to give the chairman of CEQ authority for a faster track review if there's been consultation and input by stakeholders early in the process. It is really stupid to do a 10,000-page environmental review and then have public hearings. I mean, everything is cast in stone by the time that process is in. I got my start in public life as the chair of the zoning board in part of Manhattan, and putting in comments after the fix is in, doesn't do any good to anybody. And there are a lot of bad ideas that come out of government, including on infrastructure. And one of the points we need to raise is, what's the mechanism by which we don't build bridges to nowhere or whatever, part of the process here. Really important to get public input early because there is a wisdom in crowds. So we've actually built into the statute an affirmative incentive for project proponents to go out to the public before the project is actually finally designed and talk about what the goal is and what their input is.
So you've all mentioned the importance, I'm sorry, I didn't see you there.
My name is Leslie Blakey. I'm a transportation policy consultant and I work a great deal on...
Put the mic down.
Sorry. I'm waiting.
Not that far down.
Okay. Here we go. Leslie Blakey is my name. I'm a transportation policy consultant. I work a great deal on innovative finance. And my question is primarily for Michael. When we talk about all this, and I completely agree that permit reform is essential, especially to kind of universal goals, but certainly goals of this administration of making it possible to have more private capital come in to the public infrastructure financing and support. But everybody keeps talking about infrastructure banks, and that's a million different things to a million different people, I think. The problem with that concept, as I see it, is that infrastructure banks don't create money. They don't raise the gas tax. They don't create a source of revenue to fund projects such as pothole filling. And so when we talk about infrastructure banks, as though that's a financing, it may be a financing solution as long as there is a revenue source, but it's really not a funding solution for the public part of any deal. So what I'd like to know is, from you all's thinking, where was the money going to come from? It's otherwise, basically, it's just a kind of elevated bonding or loan institution created by the federal government, which does not do anything but postpone the debt.
So I basically agree entirely with that, and that's why I believe strongly that an infrastructure bank or whatever mechanism you put in place to encourage infrastructure financing is not going to be the solution if you aren't complementing that with robust public investment. Now, the attractive thing about an infrastructure bank kind of doing what it is able to do is that you can capitalize it with fewer resources and create and leverage kind of federal funds for its purpose. So if you look at a program like TIFIA, which in one model of an infrastructure bank is, it could kind of be seen as a model for what an infrastructure bank would look like. TIFIA, you capitalize it with a certain amount of funding in the budget process, and then it can leverage that funding 10 to 1 just in terms of the amount of money it can put out the door. So $1 of funding for TIFIA can produce a $10 loan. But again, that is a loan, so it needs to be supporting revenue-generating projects, and then it can come alongside private capital in a specific project to have an important impact. So again, I guess the point is it's an important potential mechanism for increasing infrastructure financing, but policymakers really need to think hard about coming up with a broader source of funding itself, whether that's the gas tax, whether that's doing it through deficit spending or some other mechanism.
You know, let me ask you a question. So we did a sheet, just because to me money about infrastructure is like grasping in the fog. I mean, there are all these different ideas, nobody seems to put them together. So we have a sheet out there, it's a one-pager of sources and uses and all the ideas that are on the table about how you finance infrastructure. And some of them, they range from the repatriation to just straight, you know, appropriations from Congress, carbon tax. You can use carbon tax to raise a lot of money. You can some of that to offset the problems in middle and lower income, and some of them. So there are many different ideas. What recipe? Because some things you can generate, you can get private capital, get income from it. What do you think the recipe is, given the amount of infrastructure invested just to bring us back up to sort of eliminating inefficiencies and decrepit structures? What is the mix?
So I think that business tax reform and a one-time tax on unrepatriated foreign profits can be a meaningful source of one-time revenue. I think it's likely that it will becomes less likely that it will be a meaningful source given the incoming government because it requires one to impose a tax on unrepatriated foreign profits, and I think the incoming Congress and administration will be less likely than the Clinton administration would have been to do that. But I think that is a potentially promising recipe. But then over the longer term, it seems clear to me that you need to be looking at some way of generating a consistent stream of more revenue through user fees or some other mechanism like that, so that our infrastructure program is not dependent, kind of bill to bill, on where the financing is going to come from.
I think Phil mentioned some of the nice things about being at Covington. It's not only smart people, but people who know more about certain areas than you do. I'm the permitting guy. If we're going to talk about infrastructure funding, we ought to have Jack Shenendorf up there. Jack, stick up your hand so people can see you. You can talk to Jack. Jack, former chief counsel of the House Transportation Committee, probably knows more about infrastructure funding than anybody, certainly anybody I know. And I would urge everybody who wants to talk about infrastructure funding to talk to Jack during one of the breaks. Like I said, I'm the permitting guy, not the funding guy.
So with that, our panel has come to a close. I'd like to thank Philip and Common Good for putting this together, Covington for hosting us, and our panel for getting today off to a terrific start. Let's give them a round of applause.
Great. Thank you.